Welcome to today's episode, where we will be exploring how providers across Wales are supporting young people to become independent thinkers, able to reason, reflect, to question, and to make considered decisions. Independent thinking is a central part of Curriculum for Wales and enables people to become ambitious, capable learners ready to learn for life. I'm Anna Bolt, I'm HMI with Estyn, and I'm delighted to welcome today Luke Tweedley, Head of Oakfield Primary School, and Rhys Hopkins, Deputy Head at Fitzallen High School, who are going to help me to unpack this topic a little bit more. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very much.
So, to kick off the conversation, shall we start with thinking about some of perhaps the challenges and opportunities around independent thinking in your schools?
Yeah, so I think for my context, we have over 60% free school meals. So many of our children come in sort of below the expected level. And I think when you develop independent thinking, it's not just about what you want the children to do, it's about the environment that you need to create to enable them to do that. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about a psychologically safe environment. So when you're challenging children, to be resilient and to think on their own, to refine and reflect, and not just think about what they're doing, but think about how they're making progress. We spent a lot of time with staff unpicking what a psychologically safe environment looks like, and then all of the professional learning needs that come with that as well, in terms of making sure that staff are aware of how to challenge children and when to push and when not to push. And schools are busy places and we're all doing lots of things. So I think sometimes we can get bogged down in what we think we have to do and maybe forget and live in the moment a little bit with all the pressures that we have. In secondary school, I'm not sure how it works, but you have a turnover quite quickly, don't you? The bell goes and they're with you, and then suddenly the bell goes again and they're not with you.
Yeah, 53-minute periods, exactly, yeah.
It's quite a different structure in primary school, where maybe the way in which it's set up allows us a bit more time and, give children that time to think. But yeah, so we've looked at the environment and we looked at professional learning for staff, but there is that worry, if you have a slowly approach and allow children the time, are you able to cover all the things that you need to cover as well? The curriculum is broad, it needs to be balanced, but it's the kind of systems and mechanisms that we've got in place, I think.
Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think the kind of comment there about drawing that kind of balance between kind of breadth and depth and so on, and giving people that space is really important. One of the things I was kind of reflecting on in anticipation of coming on today was, I guess, independent thinking skills, much like any skills, can't be, I guess, done in a vacuum. And so I think one of the things that we talk a lot about is that skills are the kind of point of education, right? We want people to leave school with the skills they need to be successful later on in life, and whether that be literacy, numeracy, or the ability to kind of make judgments and be critical of the things in the world around them. But in order to, I guess, develop and apply those skills, they need to draw upon a deep knowledge base in order to be able to do that. And I think that one of the challenges for us is ensuring that through our curriculum we kind of systematically build that knowledge so that they are able to then at points, for example, make judgments or play an instrument with flair or unlock a defence in a PE lesson, but they do that by having that kind of deep contextual understanding, which sets them up to be successful.
Okay. How do you manage the environment then? Luke talked about, that is quite important, but maybe it's a little more of an opportunity in a primary school, maybe a little bit more of a challenge in a secondary school. How do you enable that when you have got those sort of quick changes between not just lessons, but subjects, experiences and staff?
Yeah, I think I'm sure there's commonality there as well, right? We absolutely will agree that in order for pupils to kind of to be able to do that psychological safety that Luke referred to, and actually we know that in order for pupils to achieve any level of success in school, they've got to feel as though they belong in that school, right? They've got to feel as though their voice is valued, and so for us, creating an environment which is orderly and predictable and calm is an enormous part of it. But also fostering those really strong relationships between staff and pupils is massive as well. Building the rapport with those pupils, believing in them, having high expectations of all of them, not just kind of putting a ceiling on, I guess, what is possible that those pupils, and all pupils are capable of kind of deep thinking, right, and are capable of getting towards, having those independent thinking skills that we're chatting about, whether that be making a judgment or comparing two poems, for instance, but having those high expectations of them and fostering an environment in which they can thrive is crucial.
Yeah. It sounds as though both of you have sort of steeped this into a vision for your whole school approach, really. Is that how you've gone about it? Has it been done quite naturally, or has there been a sort of more strategic way of planning this development?
I think for us, and I'm sure Luke will speak to this in a moment, it kind of is part of a broader vision, I guess, of having really high expectations of all the pupils. I think I talked a little bit earlier about the curriculum and the role that that plays, and I think giving pupils the opportunity to, I guess, like participate in the discourse of each subject, so asking the kind of questions that historians ask or questions that scientists ask, having those really high expectations of them, and ensuring that we, as best as we can, create a kind of a curriculum which is a coherent narrative for them, one that's kind of carefully, guides them to develop those kind of knowledge and skills and experiences, which they can then draw upon in order to kind of, I guess, like foster those opportunities for really kind of deep independent thought and so on. So I think that possibly rather than having an explicit vision for thinking independently, that would be kind of part of our kind of broader vision of a knowledge-rich curriculum that gives pupils the kind of powerful knowledge that powerful people have, so that they're able to become really effective citizens in the world, right, and participants in our democracy and so on. I think that's really important, and the profile of Fitzallen School, I guess, is similar. We hover around kind of 40% of pupils eligible for free school meals, and exactly as Luke said, having like really high expectations of those pupils, all our pupils, is at the heart of what we do.
And is it straightforward to get your staff to buy into that vision?
No, I think just going back to something you said, around knowledge rich, knowledge and thinking, they're interdependent, aren't they? You can't have one without the other. You need knowledge to think, but you also need really good thinking skills to make sense of knowledge as well. And I think, coming back to your question, it was strategically, it's the culture that we've set in the school. We had an Estyn recommendation before my time at the school in 2017 that said independence was really good in kind of early years provision, but maybe wasn't across the school. And then when I came to the school 3-4 years ago, look at the recommendations and you think about what's coming. So, how do you create, independence in learning, but independence in thinking, because thinking and learning are also intertwined. So we sat down and we looked at what are the things that children need to be able to think and learn independently. And that's the ultimate ambition, curriculum for Wales, ambitious, capable learners, lifelong learning, those sorts of things. So we went down the route of thinking about kind of how we develop agency in our curriculum. So how do children have opportunities within our curriculum to make choices about maybe the way in which they learn, because children learn in different ways, don't they? But also have some agency in terms of what they learn. That's not by saying, we're just going to see what happens today. It's really thought out in terms of the process that we go through, and we use a process of inquiry-based learning. But that's something that we have taken our time to introduce, where we come up with provocations for learning, and children present their learning in different ways. They do big performances of understanding at the end of their inquiries where they take action. And I think it's also about the connection that children have to their learning. So it's giving them some autonomy, but it's them feeling connected to what it is that they're learning. And I've worked in a range of schools, and I think for my school, where I am now, it's really important that children see a connection in what it is that they're learning. Otherwise, they can become quite disengaged, and I'm sure that's the same at secondary. Do they see the purpose in what it is that they're learning? And then we need to build in time for them to reflect as well on what it is that they've been learning, how they've learnt effectively, and what they might have learnt in this inquiry that they could take forward with them. So, but we thought about that as an SLT, and then we thought about how we want to kind of disseminate that. And so it was a strategic approach that then required school development planning, professional learning. For us, we've used Kath Murdoch's Power of Inquiry to structure our inquiry approach to learning. So that involves sending all of your teachers on training, and that's really important that everyone's hearing the same message as well. So then the other challenge you've got is consistency across the school. I mean, your school's far bigger than mine. We're a one-form entry primary. But how do you develop consistency? Not to say that the classrooms are the same, but that teachers have similar expectations of children, but children have similar opportunities within their classroom as well. So those are some of the things that we've kind of considered.
It sounds as if you both embraced Curriculum for Wales and the opportunities it can bring to enable pupils to have those sorts of opportunities to become independent thinkers. I'm just wondering, does the curriculum bring any barriers at all, though? Are there any things within the curriculum, primary, secondary, where perhaps it becomes a little bit more difficult to balance that? You talked about the knowledge and experience.
Yeah, I think I'd pick up on two things that Luke spoke really eloquent about just a few moments ago. I think that I guess the perennial challenge in a secondary school is the content requirements of the examinations, right? Whether that be the kind of GCSE exams or the A-level exams, and there is a tension undoubtedly in terms of the perception, perhaps, that staff have to cover a lot of content. I guess going back to Luke's point earlier, actually asking pupils to think deeply about that content is the thing that in the end supports them to kind of transfer that learning to sort of long-term memory and I guess to kind of embed into understanding and therefore seeing those two things as somehow being in tension with one another is possibly not that helpful. Encouraging that is kind of part of that process.
Certainly, you're talking about examinations, but you've talked about it in terms of it being an opportunity as well as a challenge. Perhaps you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, look, I don't want to sort of like gaslight staff in the secondary school who are struggling currently to kind of come to terms with the new qualifications and the pressures that brings. But I guess I would kind of... I would sort of urge, I suppose, colleagues in school and the staff in Fitzallen are remarkable and incredibly kind of motivated, talented people, that those things shouldn't necessarily be seen in tension with one another. And actually, in reality, it's the kind of thinking deeply, which ultimately will support their kind of learning and understanding as well. Yeah.
So how do you both manage that perhaps worry about coverage that you talked about?
So we actually worked as part of a cluster. So the Pencoitra cluster of primaries work together to look at how we can simplify the curriculum and make it really accessible for our learners, because within the Pencoitra cluster, you've got an average of around 40% free school meals. So we share a lot of the similar socioeconomic challenges, and the majority of us feed the same comprehensive school. So our leaders of learning got together and we looked at all of the 27 What Matters statements, how we might be able to group them in terms of some broader concepts that intertwine with AOLEs. So what we've ended up doing is simplifying our 27 What Matters statements into 12 cluster concepts. And the idea around the cluster concepts is that regardless of which of the 6 primary schools you go to, children will have shared knowledge, skills and experiences. So by doing that and doing the mapping of, if you're covering one of the concepts, you might be covering 3 or 4 of the AOLEs. And I realise that's different to our comprehensive colleagues, because they can't do that, and you teach, predominantly in your subject areas. So we've kind of stripped back the curriculum and then rebuilt it into our 12 cluster concepts. And what that's allowed us to do is, again, go into real detail and a deep dive into our inquiries. So we have all of our primary schools do an inquiry approach, slightly different in terms of the semantics of what that looks like in schools. But, if you're covering a humanities inquiry in a half term, you might be dipping into health and wellbeing. You'll certainly be dipping into literacy, numeracy. So we've rebuilt it, and it's provided us with more time in our curriculum to go slowly, and it's built on progressively as we go through the years as well. So that has freed us up, some more time to be quite creative with our curriculum, whilst also still teaching maths, numeracy discreetly, and having an eye on standards as well. But that co-creation of a curriculum, a cluster curriculum, has been really beneficial. And primary school, teachers from across our cluster have got together and co-created that as well. A lot like we did with Curriculum for Wales, it was co-created by teachers, pioneer schools across Wales. We've almost done that again at another level, and teachers can speak really articulately about what the concepts mean to them, but also what learning and what thinking needs to happen within each of those concepts.
That's really interesting, and actually I'd be really keen to see some of that work has gone on. We've taken a broadly similar approach, I guess, although you explained that really well. And I think what I would kind of add to that is the idea that having those, we sometimes refer to them as big ideas or kind of overarching concepts. It gives the curriculum coherence, but equally in relation to our conversation about kind of independent thinking, that there's a rigour in that, right? So there's a kind of, we talk a little bit in secondary school sometimes about the tyranny of the content, because there's so much of it, and actually kind of keeping in mind that these kind of bigger overarching concepts, often like big, knotty, gnarly, abstract ideas, which pupils will only get by kind of encountering sort of like, I guess they reach understanding of that by encountering those in multiple concrete examples. And that, I suppose, helps to kind of what's the real important elements here that we need to keep in mind, and what is potentially important and interesting, but not necessarily crucial in terms of building that kind of long-term understanding of those big ideas.
So we use big ideas, or is it Win Harlan?
Yeah.
We have that approach when it comes to our curriculum planning.
Yeah.
So in terms of our curriculum inquiry overviews, we have a big idea or a big concept, and that is that's the focus of our inquiry. But then within that, we build in the cross-curricular responsibilities. How are we ensuring that we're still covering the DCF? What opportunities, meaningful opportunities, do children have to apply their digital thinking? And we also have on our inquiry planning thinking routines, which is Ron Richart, who is based in Harvard University, and he talks about 8 cultures that you need within your school for children to think deeply about learning. So, we've mentioned environment. It's about the opportunities that staff provide, both in your curriculum and in, experiences that children have. It's about routines. You mentioned at the very start about the routine, that children need regular routine and understand what's happening now and what's happening next. And that role modelling. So that role modelling of thinking, I think that can be lost in schools, because there's that chase to get through. And it's really important that we showcase to children that we're also learners as well, and that we might not have all of the answers. There's nothing funnier than seeing a primary school teacher pretend like they don't know the answer, and the children go mad. They love it, don't they? And it's that moment where they realise, actually, teachers don't know everything, and that's okay, and you can role model how you might overcome that, and who might you ask that might be able to give you that information. But those are thinking skills and evaluation skills that children need to develop. So we have our thinking routines are really well thought out, and it comes from The Cultures of Thinking and Learning, which is a great book if you haven't read it.
I'd like to pick up on that, I think, because there's something really interesting in that, in terms of that idea of kind of teachers as role models. And I think one of the things that I guess, potentially like a kind of a misconception that exists around sort of developing independence is that means you need to necessarily like immediately give more independence. I was speaking to one of our languages teachers who, or the head of languages actually, and she talks about the kind of process of learning in languages from going for one which is really heavily scaffolded, so lots of kind of teacher input, teacher modelling, through to kind of starting to remove some of those scaffolds, so possibly like gap fills and bad translations, until you're eventually with language acquisition aiming for some measure of like spontaneity, I guess, right? And actually the way that you kind of lead pupils to independence is through lots of support initially, and then the kind of gradual release of that. And if I reflect on my own kind of career, I think possibly in the past, when I was trying to sort of think of ways to promote pupils to be more independent, I almost give them kind of more independence and they were ready for at that point, and something which kind of I think actually when we talk about like teachers coming in, often it's not necessarily that they scaffold too early, but those scaffolds don't come away at the necessarily the right point when people are kind of ready for that sort of next desirable difficulty, I guess.
That resonates, so well with us. We've also used a lot of Guy Claxton's work around the learning power approach. So he talks about, your zone of proximal development and, scaffolding, and but children also need to struggle. That's where the growth happens. So he calls it the strategic struggle. And children need that as well, because otherwise there becomes that learnt dependency, doesn't there? On, if I sit here long enough, somebody's going to come and help me. It'll probably be the LSA. And we had to work really hard in school, absolutely scaffolding at the start. But when does scaffolding become too much support? So, scaffolding should be in that challenge zone. So you've got resources or, prompts that might help you. But we've had to really focus on scaffolding, because scaffolding can quite quickly come support, which can quite quickly come, I want that child to be successful and I'm going to help them to do that. And, oh, look, you've been successful today. We've done this together. And it comes from a genuinely good place. And our LSAs are fantastic. But we've had a lot of professional learning more recently around too much support. We need to go back to that scaffolding. And it's okay for children to struggle. We've got that safe environment where children know that they are loved and they're supported. And it's okay to struggle, and we're not going to find things easy all of the time. But that's where growth happens. Otherwise, it becomes too easy, or they don't learn to do things themselves. So that's very pertinent to my school. Anyway.
In the secondary context as well, I think what is kind of massive is when the idea, I guess, like to be an expert in something, implicit within that is a measure of independence, right? So that kind of spontaneity we talked about in language, or the ability to kind of play a musical instrument with flair, for instance, that comes at the end of a continuum, right? So that you've kind of gone from a kind of a novice in that in that area through to an expert. And what I guess we need to kind of guard against in the secondary context is imagining that doing really well on the exam it constitute excellence somehow, and I think having a kind of an end goal that extends beyond the exam is really important, because it can be otherwise overly tempting to scaffold things to such an extent that pupils learn all these kind of rubrics and acronyms to be successful in exam questions, and actually that is instead of thinking deeply and being able to kind of like work out for themselves how to respond to a question, for instance. And that is often, I think, why people are struggling with that leap from GCSE to A-level, that it feels so enormous, because there's been things have potentially been so heavily scaffolded prior to that. And look, we get the reasons for that. We're in the business of supporting pupils to kind of overcome barriers to learning, and it's a delicate kind of balancing act, right? And I guess that's why like AI won't be taking the jobs of teachers too soon, because like that human kind of understanding and the ability to work with those young people and recognise, as you were saying, when is the moment to say, actually, I want a bit more from you here is kind of, it goes back to the safety and the relationships and all those things, I think.
You're both really giving a really holistic approach to this aspect, but you're really just talking about developing the whole person. You answered the question, both of you answered the question. One of the questions that I had really was around scaffolding and how you deal with that. And I think that came across quite clearly. But I think as well, what's interesting now is that we've kind of pulled in the pedagogy and how skillful teachers and teaching assistants and support staff need to be. It's not just about the experiences you give them; it's the way you teach and what your expectations of learning are really important in this as well, and bringing that all together. So, how do you do that? How do you elicit that skill in your staff, and then how do you ensure that it works? That it has the impact that you want it to have.
It's in terms of like their ability to elicit.
Know. You talked about knowing when to be there, when to withdraw, what experiences to give them, and where it belongs, I guess.
I think that's a really good question. I think that there's kind of undoubtedly, I couldn't agree more. Right, that it's a difficult job, isn't it? And the teachers do in Fitzallen and I'm sure in Oakfield as well an incredible job at that. Having those kind of high expectations of the curriculum, I think, is massive, so that they are not being asked kind of necessarily to, in the moment, think of ways in which they can really kind of stretch people's understanding, but the burden of kind of progression, I guess, rests with the curriculum. So making sure that the curriculum, as the pupils progress through it, we talk about it, Christine Council says this, right, it's a story that changes the pupils, and that each juncture it needs to become kind of more sophisticated and more challenging as they progress through. But then I think it's, a lot around the kind of professional learning of staff as well, understanding that, kind of responding to the pupils in the class and making those kind of adaptations. We talk a little bit less, I guess, in Fitzallen about kind of differentiation, and we prefer the idea of adapting practice. That's one of our sort of Fitzallen fundamentals. And I think what that kind of reminds us is that rather than having perhaps fixed expectations of what pupils are capable of, that we really dial into where they're at that moment and kind of meet them where they're at. And it might be that sometimes that is as much about taking support away as it is about putting some additional support in place. Because, and this, I guess, resonates with what we're chatting about, right? It's the kind of, the deep thought, which is the kind of thing that helps them to learn, isn't it? And Luke spoke really well about that earlier on. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think for us, it is, as I mentioned at the start, about that kind of consistency and approach across the school, and being intentional about the thinking that we want children to do. And it goes back to the other point around modelling, so teachers being able to do that. So consistency, for us, it was around a shared language and modelling. So we developed a shared language around learning. So we developed a set of learning dispositions, which we talk to children about all the time. So, are you putting in effort? Are you self-aware? Are you aware of how your actions are having, implications on others? We talk to children about curiosity. So, we want children to be curious. And there's that, how many questions do children ask in a day? If you've got children, they're really young, they ask questions about absolutely everything. But I think by the time they kind of go to university, they maybe ask one question a day that's, got any sort of depth or thought to it. And how do we retain that curiosity so it doesn't become a funnel where we kind of funnel down curiosity and inquisitiveness and wonder about the world? So we talk to teachers a lot about that. But one of the things that we do to support teachers is we have a looking at learning cycle, so an MER cycle. And within our looking at learning cycle, we do a cultures of learning, learning walk. And that's around Ron Richart's 8 cultures of thinking. So we choose 2 or 3 of those. So it might be about modelling, expectations and experiences. So we will look at those as we go through the school and just focus on those lenses. And from that, then we'll come out with some what's gone well, even better ifs. And where we've probably had the most success is around some of our intervention support. So when you talk about scaffolding, you talk about the support that we offer. It's quite often LSAs that are providing that support for children. And they might be children that might not be ready to think at that deep level yet. But again, it comes back to that point that Guy Claxton makes, is around children need the opportunity to struggle to be able to grow. So what we have done in school is have peer-to-peer observations. So where our learning support assistants pair up and they observe each other. So, a peer observation support as well. So we'll highlight, really good practice, and our teachers and staff are fantastic, and they want to continuously grow and want to continuously learn. So that has, happened in school, and it's been really beneficial, and they feel really supported. But it's not by a member of SLT coming in and saying, you need to do this. It's growth, it's genuine collaboration together, and it's has a real impact. It's really low threat because, it's conversations and providing time for them to observe each other and then provide each other with feedback as well. That's been really beneficial. And, and we've seen then in subsequent learning walks and listening to learner sessions that's had a real impact on, how we allow children to develop their thinking and learning.
And does what happens as a result of all of that, what you see as the success of all of that work, does that help with the momentum? Does it help to just, to keep you thinking, yeah, this is the way that we should be going ahead with our learners? It is making a difference. Is it making a difference to your learners?
I'm okay to jump in.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. So hand in hand with us introducing our learning dispositions a few years ago, what we've also introduced are pupil learner reviews. So, it's not my idea. I went to go and see a school in Newport, Jubilee Park, amazing school, quite a different context to our school. So it is about, going, seeing something, adapting it, bringing it back for your school. But we now provide teachers with a day a term where they meet with every pupil individually. And because, when you're getting children to think deeply about their learning, but also reflect on the journey that they've been on. And I've been into some of the year 5 and 6 conversations, and we've been doing this for about 18 months now. And the way children are able to talk about their learning is just so impactful, and they're really proud of the things that they've achieved. So in our pupil learner reviews, the children reflect on how they are being and becoming the 4 purposes. So we don't teach the 4 purposes explicitly. They happen around us. It's a little bit through osmosis, but when it comes to reflecting, they do reflect on how they're becoming ambitious. They do reflect on how they've challenged themselves. They do reflect on what challenges they've overcome, what they learnt from those challenges, and then what they're going to do going forward. So, knowing where they've had success, knowing where they're going. But teachers have found the PLRs really beneficial in terms of sitting down with children, no interruptions. This is about this child, their learning and the journey that they're on. And we can see from the conversations and the way in which children record. So the children record their own pupil learner reviews. So that's from year 3 to year 6. When you look at last year's ones compared to this year's, we can see it's having an impact because they are thinking deeply about themselves as learners, not just the learning that's happened.
That sounds amazing. I'd love to come and see that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think just to kind of pick up on something that I guess like that intrinsic in kind of self-motivation, right, is that sense of like being successful, and whether that is kind of the teaching staff having that sort of sense of job satisfaction because they can see the impact of that, but equally the pupils themselves as well, right? And if we want them to kind of be interested in the things that we are teaching them, then we've got to kind of give them a voice, I guess. So whether that be, in our history lessons, they might be asked to think about, why Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, for instance, and to reflect on what the causation of that was, and what it to do with kind of like gender, perception to gender at the time, or with the religious kind of reasons and so on, that I guess like is interesting for pupils and kind of draws them in on the basis that they feel that their voice is valued and heard. And I spoke about our languages lessons earlier. It could be our maths lessons, our science lessons. Pupils feeling as though they're being successful is massive in terms of building that intrinsic motivation in themselves, and equally for teachers to kind of keep doing it each day as well, right?
And that consistency in expectation and provision is really important as well. And I think what I've heard from both of you is that you're allowing the staff and the pupils that time and space they need to do these things. I'm not getting a sense of anything being rushed at all. It's, sometimes can be a bit scary to be taking things slowly, but it sounds as if in doing that, it makes a difference. The depth of learning is there, and then the long-term knowledge and understanding comes with it.
I have to say, I'm really interested in the idea of the kind of explicitly teaching pupils sort of almost how to think, and that you were speaking about, and that is something I think we could learn from, actually, and I'd be keen to have a look at that at some point.
I think we'll be exchanging emails at the end of this.
Actually, I tell you what is interesting as well is perhaps that the transition point. How does that work, and where are we seeing perhaps some effective practice around that?
Yeah, so we've done something broadly similar to what Luke described earlier, working with our cluster, and we're really fortunate to work with a really strong cluster, trying to map learning across that sort of 3 to 16 continuum. And we are a larger cluster, I guess, than the one you described. So we've got 9 schools as part of our cluster. And the point, I guess, is not necessarily to dictate necessarily the kind of content of the curriculum in those schools, but have the understanding that we are working towards some kind of overarching concepts, and whether that is exemplified, for example, that matter can change from liquid to a gas, for instance, whether that's exemplified by watching an ice cream melt down a Cardiff Bay here, or whether that is an experiment conducted in the river adjacent to the school, but working towards that broader conceptual understanding, so that at the point when they arrive to us in year 7, there is some kind of commonality of the knowledge, skills and experiences they've acquired. And actually what we've kind of learned in that process is, I guess it kind of ties into what we're talking about, is that we need to kind of have even higher expectations about pupils at that transition point. Because one of the things we did this year was requested to see some of their books in year 6, and they brought them in, and our plan going forward with that is they will use those books in their lessons in year 7, because it's a reminder to them, like some of the incredible work they completed when they were in year 6, and equally it's signpost to our teachers as well, that the pupils are capable of an awful lot, right? And kind of we pride ourselves on having very high expectations, but actually that there are possibly for opportunities for us to kind of aim our sights even higher. And there's some absolutely remarkable work that goes on in our cluster of primary schools, and I'm sure all primary schools across Wales as well, especially Luke's.
It's interesting to hear you talk about, Fitzalan, your cluster, because we've had exactly the same conversations in September. In the summer, we took up, our books, and myself and a fellow head teacher were part of the year 6 moderation, and then the comprehensive brought their year 7 books. And, we noticed a bit of a drop-off in year 7, and there shouldn't be. It should be hit the ground running. Yeah. But you only know what you know. And I think, I'm going to definitely take that in terms of giving them the year 6 books. Don't send them home, give them to the comp so that they know where those children were at in terms of their learning, and the expectations that they have. Because if you were doing this in year 6, you're now in year 7. So I'm going to take that, but I'm going to be on the phone to our secondary head on the way home. Yeah.
And does this approach have an impact in a wider sense on your pupils? For example, in terms of engagement, attendance, do you see the benefits in other ways, not just in the sort of planned curriculum?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to draw kind of lines between A to B, and with things like kind of attendance and so on. I think it is part of a broader culture, right? Of where, you know, having those kind of like high expectations of the pupils, expecting them to, you know, giving them a voice within the curriculum.
You're valuing them. You're valuing what they've got to bring.
One of the things that we talk a lot about is that like pupils need to see themselves in our curriculum. I think that's something which is really important. And one of the opportunities a Curriculum for Wales gives us is real autonomy in terms of what we teach, and we think deeply as teachers about the rationale for why we teach those things. And I think all of those things kind of, you know, that idea of creating that learning environment that feels safe, and there's probably something there in those transition reflections earlier, right, that actually it takes people a while to feel as though they belong, in order to be able to do some of that best work when they arrive at secondary school. But then that, in conjunction with the high expectations, in conjunction with setting them up to be successful, is I guess one of the reasons why, you know, our pupils are very aspirational, and they for the most part enjoy coming to school and want to do well, and I certainly think that there is a connection, certainly if not a straight line.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you mentioned at the start, didn't you, about relationships and how important they are. I think they're fundamental in terms of attendance. So, you know, and that sense of belonging, those are two of the biggest things in you know, your children can get themselves to school. My children, you know, below the age of kind of year 4, they're reliant on their parents to get them to school. But what we've noticed is as we've kind of been taking this approach is that, and it comes back to my earlier point around them feeling a connection between the learning that they're doing and maybe lifelong aspirations. And, you know, with the context of our school, we have to be really aspirational, but we have to show them what's outside there in, you know, the big wide world as well. But they feel part of something. They feel like they, you know, belong in terms of the school. But our attendance has improved by 5% over the last 4 years, which is incredible, which shows you how low it was at the start. But a 5% increase. And I genuinely believe in year 4, 5 and 6, it's that they love coming to school, that they are walking themselves to school. They are, you know, wanting to be part of the school and feel like they contribute and they belong. And that's fundamental, because if you don't feel like you belong and you don't have the relationships with staff, what incentive is there for you to go to school? So I think we've started to grow something really, really special. We just need to improve our attendance a little bit more.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. 5%. Wow. Yeah.
So going forward, how do we make sure then that this focus on supporting children with their independent thinking continues, and that, you know, that is something that we see across Wales in providers? What would be your takeaways?
I'm going to throw it back to you. I think that Estyn have a big role to play in this. I think that you know, the things that Estyn put out in terms of thematic reviews and case studies, I think that schools look at them. I think that, you know, they're aware of what Estyn are focusing on, and rightly or wrongly, Estyn drive behaviour in schools, and that could be really positive. So I think that it might form, you know, part of it, you know, some of the case studies that come out from you, this podcast, for example, hopefully, we'll have some people thinking about their deep thinking about how that might translate to their school. But I think also it's, you know, the onus is on schools to collaborate together as well.
I was just going to say, you've both talked about sharing, you know, and I think that's come through quite strongly.
Yeah, and I think that one of the good things in Wales, especially in terms of the Estyn inspection framework, is that there isn't that competitiveness between schools. So, you know, schools that are doing really good things can share them, and that's, you know, that you're not keeping it behind closed doors to say, oh, we do something really good. There should be that culture of collaboration between schools. And I think that, you know, now is the opportunity with the curriculum, with the new inspection framework or the latest inspection framework, that we should be sharing. And if, you know, if the schools are doing really good things, that they should have the opportunity to share and showcase those and learn from each other, because I'll be visiting Fitzallen soon.
You're very welcome. Yeah, likewise. Yeah, I think, look, I would wholeheartedly agree with everything Lucas said, and, you know, we've certainly got a lot to learn in terms of, I'm really interested in that idea of sort of almost explicitly teaching pupils ways in which they can become more independent. From our perspective, I guess, what the things that we have learned, it would be kind of the understanding that those skills can't be taught in the abstract, and that actually what they require, if we want people to think deeply, whether that be in their art lessons or their geography lessons, having a curriculum that kind of systematically promotes that deep sort of or rich knowledge and skills and experiences is massively important. I think, again, we spend a lot of time thinking about curriculum and making sure that kind of rigour and expectation that pupils will think deeply is embedded within the curriculum. So we encouraging kind of questions for learning, almost, that where pupils are invited, as I think I mentioned earlier, to kind of participate in the discourse of the subject. That's super important. So they get to think like a scientist or think like a geographer, for example. And then I think that I thought it was really interesting what Luke was saying around kind of the role that teachers play in sort of almost this idea of sort of narrating the thought process of an expert, and which was I think how you described it. And I think that kind of what requiring pupils or expecting pupils to be more independent doesn't necessarily mean giving them lots more independence immediately. Actually, there's a real role for kind of teacher expertise within that, and then kind of understanding at what point to kind of introduce that desirable difficulty, and I think, but then being willing to kind of ensure that that kind of struggle is part of it. And I guess there's an implication there around kind of lesson observation, and the idea that you can necessarily judge learning in a 53-minute lesson is sort of probably pretty far-fetched, right? Actually, that's a long-term change in their kind of understanding, and we need to take potentially a more holistic view of that. And it might be that they struggle in 1 or 2 lessons, but if the expectations of them are high, then that's to be expected, right? And we encourage that, and we create an environment in which they feel safe enough to accept that kind of struggle. And as you were saying earlier, we model to them the mistakes are part of the process, and we make ourselves vulnerable in front of the pupils. And I thought there was so much that Luke was chatting about, which is so interesting, and definitely lots of food for thought.
I think that maybe something that might potentially put some schools off is that fear of giving them too much independence also might cause other issues in the classroom in terms of behaviour, staying on task, those sorts of things. But I would just implore anybody to, I've mentioned a few education lists today, where we got lots of our thinking from. Guy Claxton, Ron Richart are just 2. But to see the benefit in this, we spoke about kind of strategic vision. What are the long-term goals and aspirations? It is that lifelong learning. It's going back to the 4 purposes. But by doing this, it creates more opportunities for more learning to happen. And like you said, it transcends all subjects, doesn't it? Because it becomes a habit. So I think it's seeing the value in the child, beyond, and in their education. So we spoke at the very start about kind of time and coverage and those sorts of things. It actually pays dividends in the end. I think it helps, because children are able to apply those skills and those habits, across everything in life.
Thank you both. It's been inspiring to hear how you are supporting children and young people to become independent learners. And I think some of the things that I've definitely picked up are around, it's not straightforward. It's something you do have to think about. It's careful planning, and it's skillful questioning, and it's strategic vision, and it's allowing children and young people that space and time to be reflective, and giving them the valuing them and their ideas and their thought processes, and really allowing them to sort of make decisions and to be part of that learning as well. So that's been very helpful today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting us.
And you can find further insights in Estyn's case studies and in their thematic reports online.